Hello. What I want to work on now with us is to be able to start moving into how do we test our Rails applications. And before really diving deep into the testing, I think it's really important that it's been a while for everyone. I think it's good if we get sort of a review of what's going on in Rails, and that will help sort of give us a map of where are we going to be actually testing and where do the different types of tests apply. So first, let's review what's going on with our web apps that we've built in Rails. So these things are, as we've talked about, these are multiple tier apps, and the user interface tier is over here. And so this is, your computer. Or to put this another way, this is perhaps the user's computer, okay? Laptop, whatever it is, phone, I don't care. But now on it is a program. And inside this program is one of the many programs running on the computer. And this happens to be the web browser, okay? And there's lots of different makes of web browsers out there. You've got Google Chrome, you've got Firefox, you've got Safari on the Mac. Microsoft has something, I think it's Edge now. Anyway, so you've got your browser. And the great thing about the browser is that it has the ability to send requests, send HTTP, that's Hypertext Transfer Protocol requests, to another computer out there on the internet. And so, for example, you might have a computer out here that's running, that you're hosting your app at. So, for example, you could, maybe it's my app at Heroku app.com. So there's some other computer out here running on the internet, and the web browser makes a request through to that computer, and that request then, based upon the port, gets routed to the web server, which is a program running, on this computer. It's one of the many programs running there, and so this, this is a HTTP request, again, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So a request goes out and goes over, and so for example, you might have requested, the home page of the app that's running on this machine, goes to the web server. The web server that we are running is Puma. Okay, and Puma is then, we have connected to it a whole bunch of code for Rails. And so Puma actually says, oh, I've got that request, and hands it off over to Rails. And Rails, in its processing of it, is quite likely, because we built it this way, it's got to be a really cool app, so it's got to have a database attached to it. And this is running, the database could be running on the same machine, but it's actually most likely not. It's most likely hosted on another machine somewhere. And so this is a network connection that it makes. We think about talking to it in terms of SQL or SQL. And we've got our database here with all of its tables and data, and we'll get responses back from it. And then our Rails app will have processed and done all this great stuff in response to whatever the request is, and so basically Puma goes to Rails and Rails goes back to Puma, and out comes a response, which is an HTTP response. And these responses are either of the form of, oh, this has really gone really well, successfully, and it sends back a whole bunch of HTML, so hypertext markup language, that then the browser renders, and it looks really nice to you. You know, it's got titles and buttons and images and all sorts of good stuff, and that shows up for you. Or it might be a redirect that sends you and tell you to make another request to go to another page that it then processes and sends back, and eventually sends back the HTML for you to actually display in response. All right, that's the basic setup. It's, you know, and so this is why it's multi-tier. We've got a tier here, the user, and this is the user interface portion of the system lives here. Requests go back and forth. We've got our web server, and our web server then talks to our database. It's a great system. It's wonderfully complex, though. These databases, the web servers, and the browsers are all huge programs, actually. And while we write what seems to be a substantial amount of code here, in fact, we're writing a small amount of code that is basically plugged into the larger program here, and then everything is working back and forth, and it's really quite amazing. So that's the overall setup. Now let's talk about some of the details, such as the HTTP request, what's really going on with Rails, and then we'll be able to see how we're generating these responses back out. We already know tons about the databases. We don't need to talk about all that sort of stuff. We don't need to know really anything about the way the browser works, except that the browser is really good at taking our HTML that we send it and making it look really nice, and then allowing it to properly generate, through the user interaction, more requests to get another page, to submit data to us, and so forth and so on. So let's start with talking about what sort of requests come from the browser, because that becomes really important, because we need to respond to those requests. So we need to know what can be asked of us. So an HTTP request, the ones that we care about, there are more than this. But the ones that we care about, the really big one is a GET request. Okay, so we can get, and the GET comes along with some sort of path. Okay, so for an example, if we were to talk about this, you might have a GET, and then it comes along with a path that maybe it's /search, question mark, query equals hello, and go ahead and put an ampersand here, count equals 10 or something like this. So there's some sort of path, whole, thing that's given to us along with the GET. All right, and then we would, so that's one type of request. The other really big one is the POST. Now the POST is a path plus data, and there's always data associated with it when it's a post of some form. It might be empty, but there is data. So it might be a data thing that doesn't have anything in it, but it's always path plus the data. This big thing, so I'm not going to write a full example, but how does this get generated? This is because there's a submission of an HTML form. All right, so on that HTML page, there's a form with some inputs perhaps and a submit button. The user clicks it. The form says, ooh, I'm supposed to do a post to this URL, which is the path basically, and there you go. Off it goes the request to us. There's also the delete request, and the delete has a path, and it might have data. but it's not required to have data. So it could just be a delete and a path. There's also the patch, all right, and its path plus data. Now what's interesting is that for both of these are not possible from HTML. So it's not an issue of the browser. The browser could generate these for us if we had some way of telling the browser to do it, but all of our interaction, all of our user interaction with our app is through some HTML that we've given, and it's in the browser. And the user is interacting with that HTML. And so there's actually no way for the user to generate a delete or a patch request. And so what happens is that Rails gives us a way to fake this, all right, it's with a post, of a form. Okay, so we've got an HTML form. It's really going to go across the wire as a post request, but as part of that data that comes along, Rails helps us and includes a little bit that says, hey Rails, this is really a delete, or this is really a patch. Okay, so it's a nice way that we get to build out our web app using and being able to respond to these HTTP requests, even if we have an HTML interface with a web browser. Rails is designed so that you could build other user interfaces that are not using HTML and using HTML to make requests. And you could actually be having, for example, these HTTP requests come in, and you could be returning JSON. Okay, so another data format, and that JSON could go back to the user interface, which would decode it and change the user interface based upon the response to the request. We're not going to get involved in that. We're going to stick to using HTML. And so, but you should just know. So these are our main requests, and they come in. It's always a specific command and a path, and maybe some data attached to it. Now, again, we go from browser, making a request, goes to the web server. The web server then talks to Rails and says, here's a request for you to handle. Will you please handle it for me? And when you're done, I'll send your response back to the browser for you. And so what does Rails do with these things? Well, so Rails gets one of these requests handed to it by Puma. And the first thing Rails does is say, I need to go and look at your routes. So it goes and looks at, basically the effect is it looks at the routes RB file. And its goal is to find a matching, what we call a route. A route is just a combination of that HTTP request, a get, post, delete, patch, and a path, and it's looking for a match. In the routes, again, you've defined, for this HTTP verb, so the verb is get, post, delete, patch, and for a path that's of this form, use this route. Okay, so it goes to find a matching route given the HTTP, not RP. We'll call it the verb, get, delete, whatever, and path. Okay. The route also, so once it finds it, the big thing, I've got this match. You always pair with your route a controller and a method. Okay, it tells Rails which controller method to call. And so this is really just a big lookup. Got a request come in, and the idea is you've written lots of code, and Rails needs to know which code should I call. It's kind of like thinking about in your Java program that you've got this, main, I don't know, I've now just blanked on Java. I want to say main, you got a static main method in a particular class that you're telling Java to execute. Anyway, so you got that static method main, and Java, your program always starts there. Okay, well, here you've got basically many different entry points, which is basically many different sort of ways to start your program running based upon to handle the request. So you're routing it to one of those entry points, one of those starting methods. And those are the methods in your controllers. You could envision that basically there's just, I'm given the request and that's always, and then I process and figure out what to have happen. Rails is just saying, what we're going to do is we're going to give you this mechanism that makes it easier, because you would always end up eventually having to go, I have this type of request and this type of path. I'm going to call this method. So it's just giving you a means to write that down in a file that for this verb and path, call this method for me. Okay, so which method to call? One of the things it does then is it parses the path and the data it receives. If it, for example, I got a post with a bunch of data, and it parses them and puts them into the params hash or hash table, and sends all of that to the controller method, which is nice. So you don't have to be bothered with parsing it and everything and processing that data into a usable form. It gets turned into a very nice hash table, and you can go, okay, yeah, for this key, what's its value? It's a wonderful setup. All right, so that's what Rails first does. Go through the routes, find which controller method to call. Now, once we've done that, we're in the controller. So the controller method runs. All right, basically, we're like, good. I have, let's say, a post to /users or something. Okay, I'll process that. Now, once you're in the controller will use models, and the models are connected to the database. And so that's how we talk back and forth to our databases with our models. Now, besides models, you can write other classes as well. Okay, not everything is in the models. You could write some other class that doesn't have to be tied to the database. So keep that in mind. You can write other methods and other sorts of things as well. Now, there we go. So we're going to call our models and stuff, prepare our data, do whatever we need to do. And then the controller does one of two things, basically. So it's either going to go and it renders a view with the same name as the controller method. So if this was the my brain is losing it. I will just say if this was the show If this was the show method, it would be then rendering the show view. Okay, there's all sorts. It could be anything. It's just a convention. It's just handy to have it's by convention. Rails loves to do tons of stuff by convention rather than configuration. So rather than you saying wire up this controller with this view, it just defaults to the one with the same name. All right. So the same name as the controller method. And then it passes any of the instance variables from the controller. So the instance variables, you recall, are the ones that you've preceded with the @ sign. So if you've made any instance variables in your controller, they're passed along to the view, which is a bunch of code that you've written that's going to run. And it's in a nice templated format using this herb. Okay, so it's ends up being a mixture of HTML and Ruby code. The data gets into the view with the being passed in. So it passes in instance variables to the view and runs the view code. Now, I say runs the view code, but again, it's going to look at this templated system and be very intelligent about how to read and go, oh, that I'm just supposed to output as HTML. Ooh, here's Ruby code, and I'm going to run the Ruby code now. All right. So it does that. And then returns a response of success and the output of the render or the view, whatever you want to say it's the output of. So this is the whole thing. All right, we got a request. We do all this. We package up this data. We send it to the view. The view runs with very little logic in it, and that produces a whole bunch of HTML. Then we take that HTML and we return it and a code of success, a response of success. So we're either going to do that, or the big thing that we're going to do is we're going to end up redirecting to another page after we've gone and done all the stuff that we wanted to do with models and things. So we always redirect on a successful create, update, and destroy. So if we're creating new data in the database, if we're updating existing data, or we're destroying data, and we succeed at that, we always do a redirect to another page. Okay. So for example, when we create a new user, and it's successfully, that user is created in the database, the standard behavior is to redirect to that user's page and display that user's data and basically prove to the world that, hey, yeah, we made it and we created that user for you. Okay. Those HTTP response codes, they also have numbers associated with them. Success is a 200, and these redirects are called 302s. Okay, and so in fact, what happens is the redirect goes back to the web browser, and the web browser goes, "Oh, you want me to go to another page?" And okay, I'll go get that. It says a get to that page, and it goes and fetches that new page. It actually has to go back to the browser, and then the browser then sends in a new request to the server. That whole thing runs through the controller to run and produce that new page, and that then comes back, it renders and a success and goes back to the browser, and the user sees it happen. To the user, it looks like one request has been processed, but in fact, more than one request gets processed in these circumstances. All right, now a reminder about some key design principles of working with model view controller. So that's the basics again of Rails. I mean, as you know, there are a gigantic amount of details associated with getting it all to work, but a key design principle of these model view controllers, okay, is really all work is in the model and other classes. Not the controller. And certainly not the view. Okay. But to make this point about the view, we'll go with the next point, which is the view should have minimal logic in it. It's mainly, the view is mainly about, so it's mainly just a display of the data prepared by the controller. Now, I say prepared by the controller, but again, the controller is actually really not doing much work to get that data. It's calling, for example, the model to be like, go fetch me this from the database. Oh, great, I've got it. Hey, view, show it. Or it's going to be, oh, I know that we need it to be sorted in some special way, but there's a method on the model, and I'm going to call that method, and the model is going to run and return me this special collection of filtered data and whatnot. And yep, great, I've got it, and hand it off to the view. The controller is not going to be like, let me think about how I'm going to sort and filter and do all sorts of fancy things. I mean, your controllers should be a small amount of code. I mean, there really shouldn't be much more in them other than a couple of calls, an if statement here or there. All of that stuff is down below. Again, I really think of the controller is very minimal. All right, and then we've got the view. Well, the view is just for the mere display of the data. Okay, it's like presentation. Okay, all the work should be done in the down in the models and things. I mean, if we want to, we can think of the view sort of as the wait person at a restaurant. They're there presenting, constructing the interface, and then they are also like showing. They bring the food and they show it and they put it on the table for the customer. The controller is sort of like the head chef in the kitchen, saying, do this, do that. But then there's this huge set of people, and they're the ones who are doing all the work in the kitchen. They're the ones chopping, sauteing, mixing things together. They're all the models, okay? So the controller is like a head chef. The view is just the wait person, okay? So, yeah. And The view then, the view's job is not to do any cooking. We don't want the wait person to be doing stuff to our food. We just want our food sort of brought to us and handed to us in a nice way. And we want to be able to give then a request back to the wait person, who then gets it into the controller. All right. Oh, okay, great. And so saying that, that's not, it's kind of strange, because the wait person's like the user interface, but the view is really tightly tied to the user interface because it's the HTML that's produced. So the analogy is not perfect, but I hope this comes across. Again, shouldn't be much in the controller. You shouldn't be processing data other than to have a loop, or maybe a minor if statement or something in the view. The views are so the least amount goes here with regard to logic. A little bit more maybe here, but still most of it, this is just passing things to the view or to the model. All the hard work is in the model, or any other classes that you've written. Okay. Now, that's going to lead us into our notions of how to test, which I'll talk about next.